morning, everybody, our African friends, our European friends, and some others. And I just want to, José Manuel is always very inspiring. I was not sure about assessing some sensitive issues, but I want to underline 2 or 3 ideas he shared with you. 1, the relevance of unpredictability. In our current international situation, the unpredictable may prevail. It was always like that, but what the relevance of global phenomena like the pandemic crisis, the war declared by Russia in Ukraine, the attack from Hamas to Israel and Israel retaliation October 7, and what happened some days ago in the United States, it's the strength of the unpredictable. So businessmen, businesswomen, they should include in their mindset a place for unpredictable scenarios. And that shows also, and I think José Manuel was thinking about that also, how our international system is becoming weaker and weaker, not in capacity to avoid conflicts before they happen, not in capacity to manage conflicts and its consequences after they are declared. So we need to reshape our international system. It's easier to say than to do it, but if you just pay attention to an image of the Security Council of the United Nations, it's a photo from 1946. We are in 2024. The countries with veto power in United Nations Security Council are the winners of the war. The Second World War, as José Manuel remembered, it happened in Europe. Europe has its own private devils, and totalitarian experiences happened in Europe also in the 20th century. So that is my first, inspired by José Manuel, my first remark. The second one is about the competition between the United States, the incumbent power, and China, the challenging power. I think we will leave this tension for many years. This will follow our lives. It's different from Cold War. You know, Russian economy is very modest, in nominal terms, close to the Spanish one. Russia never opened its economy. It's oil, gas, oil, or gold, sometimes diamonds, other times. But it's not it's a military economy, more and more. But there is a big difference between China and Russia. China, as José Manuel recalled, it's absolutely impressive what happened in China economically from the 70s, the late 70s, to our days. It's Deng Xiaoping legacy. They never promised to become a democracy. They agree in the dominant role of the party, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. But what happened to the Chinese economy, it's unbelievable. They were one of the most poor and isolated countries in the world 50 years ago. They are world's #1 good exporter. They are the world's #2 R&D investor. and they want to become the first. On that sense, I just want to share how the last couple of years, the last 5 years, were very ironic. Before the COVID pandemic, China reached 75% of the nominal volume of the American economy. And they thought it was an inevitable progress. Things were different. In our days, data from 2023, China has 65% of the American nominal economy. Decreased, not increased. That gives me an inspiration to, I don't know if it's an inspiration or just wishful thinking. If you consider the political system of the United States, maybe there is a parfum of decline. But what is the source of the American power? Is it the political system? The end of the bipartisan attitude? The deadlock, the permanent deadlock between the House, the Senate, and the presidency? I don't think so. The source of the American power is the American capitalism. It's the American science. It's the American university. It's the American diversity. Never forget that 40% of the largest 500 brands of America were created by immigrants or sons of immigrants. And it's obviously the power of dollar and the power of the defense budget of the United States. But I'm not convinced that it's directly the political system. If you are in Beijing and you look what's happening in US, what would you think? Is it a rising power or it's a troubling power? If you consider just politics, it's a troubling power. If you consider economics and science and education and diversity, it's a rising power. And finally, I share with my former Prime Minister and statesman, José Manuel Durão Barroso, an intellectual admiration for Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger wrote his book on artificial intelligence when he was 98. Every Saturday morning, during one pandemic year, he was in Zoom with the former innovation director of MIT and the former CEO of a very known technological company. The result was that book on the state of the art of artificial intelligence. I'm not making jokes about the presidential election in the US, but what is definitive is not age. Is the moment you will kill your own curiosity. Dr. Kissinger kept his curiosity till the end of his life. And by the way, just to share with our European and African friends, he had one of the most amazing answers about, will artificial intelligence replace human work? You know what was the answer? A brilliant one. Yes, it will replace the human work of human workers that don't adapt to artificial intelligence. It's completely different. On artificial intelligence, I would not suggest definitive positions. You have fantastic achievements on the health system, for instance. You have troubling achievements or consequences, for instance, on the higher education integrity, academic integrity check. You have very worrying possibilities, not for the moment, on defense and weapons. And you have a very controversial field, which is intellectual property rights, everything linked to creation, to creativity. I just end this inspired remarks by telling you that once, some years ago, I'm a great fan of Frida Kahlo, a Latin American artist, very modern one, and suddenly I saw in I don't know where, but I saw a self-portrait of Frida Kahlo with a detail, and you know how God or devil are in the details. The color was not exactly the color typical of from Frida Kahlo. It was so beautiful, so impressive, so sensitive. What a glory of painting. And I said, God, she didn't paint this. She never painted this self-portrait. So the good question is this self-portrait art? Yes or no? And if this is art, who is the owner of property rights? And then you have a lot of questions to solve. So, I just want to, on artificial intelligence, we will not stop with our end the wind. And by the way, there are 3 different positions between the 3 blocks, and I'm not convinced that the European position is the best one. In US, first you innovate, then you regulate. In China, you can innovate, but it's convenient to ask the party if you can do it. In Europe, we regulate first, even if we don't innovate enough. I think we should change a little bit this mindset. On my remarks about the friendship, the complicity between Africa and Europe, I would say 2 or 3 parameters. It may be intellectually interesting to discuss the past, but we cannot remove the past. There is one thing we can do to build the future. I am focused on the future of this partnership. Second, we are separated by some dozens of miles, but we are separated by the difference between an aging continent and a very young continent. So the relationship, or we build, we care, we charm, we improve this relation, or this absence of relation will knock our door. And I personally think there are 4 or 5 fields where the cooperation between Europe and Africa, it's not only a possibility, it's mandatory, and it's a win-win situation if we Europeans, sometimes we forget that, have no condescending attitude on the relation with Africa, and we respect a relation between equals, partners, sovereign states, and independent countries. This is the only parameter for a dialogue. We are not teaching Africans how they should be Africans. This is a very stupid attitude, sometimes we find somewhere. On the geoeconomic side, I want just to share with you some good news. Because the world is unpredictable, consultant firms and international institutions are becoming pessimistic when they forecast about the economy. And you just witnessed it 2023, and you will see it again in 2024. Forecasts were pessimistic, results are better. I will quote just African Development Bank, an institution I respect a lot about Africa, that recently issued its report about 2024 in the continent. Africa will grow 3.7, up from 3.3 last year, higher than the global growth. It's the mandatory trend. Africa needs to grow more than the global growth, higher than the global growth. 40 of the 55 countries will have an improvement of their economic situation in 2024, and the situation of remittances is becoming more normal. It's one of the obvious relations between, namely, Europe and Africa, but also US and Africa. When things are not good in Europe, remittances to Africa decline. And remittances are increasing after a disaster in the pandemic years. And then it's our responsibility to avoid cuts on aid to development. Very easy and demagogic to start cuts on aid of development, but it's a strategic mistake. And then Africa has to do something more if you want to recover the golden years of foreign direct investment. That means stability, predictability, juridical trust and confidence for investors. Things on FDI are still lower than 7 or 8 years ago. On the macro, as you know better than me, you don't have one Africa, you have many Africas. And the winners for the moment in 2024, like in the last, I would say, decade, with the exception of the pandemic year, the usual winners are East Africa and West Africa. Those are the levels of growth higher than 5%. It's very impressive. And in 2024, Senegal 9.3, Côte d'Ivoire 7.1, Ethiopia 6.7, Rwanda 6.5, Benin and Uganda 6.5, Mozambique 5.2. So those are becoming the club of usual winners of growth in Africa. Communities from the East, communities from the West. There are still 1 or 2 indicators that should be a matter of reflection: the level of indebtedness, and there are 4 big African economies still with inflation higher than 2 digits. Nigeria, Egypt, Angola, and three big economies, and Ethiopia. So those are the economic trends. They are more positive than negative. The second detail I want to share with you is about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's a major diplomatic achievement in a world with no room or no sufficient room for diplomacy. We would need more room for diplomacy. In few years, it was possible to have the consensus among 54 of the 55 countries. Africa intra-trade is just 16%. If you want to become more competitive, you have to increase till the 50% minimum. And this is the good agreement to erase tariffs and facilitate businesses. It's an opportunity for Africans, and it's an opportunity for European companies with juridical and physical presence in Africa. Started in the middle of the protectionist wave, and I have a lot of hope. Two fields I want to mention, not to delay my intervention, between Europe and Africa. The one is energy. It's a typical West mistake to look at Africa just thinking in fossil energy. May I suggest you to search a little bit? 1 hour and a half from Lisbon, in Morocco, you have one of the 3 biggest solar plants of the world. Africa has all the natural conditions on renewable energy, can be, it depends on certain conditions, can be a very relevant contributor to a more balanced world with clean energy. I don't know what is the target. I wouldn't be definitive about that. But you have conditions for solar, you have conditions for wind, you have conditions for hydro, depending on the level of some big investments. So don't think about Africa just on oil and gas. That's much more than oil and gas. And by the way, not all, but many of the winners of growth are diversified economies. They just don't depend only in natural resources. So this is one level of mandatory cooperation. Europe, as José Manuel remembered, had to decouple from Russia. We had 2 years ago. It's a success. We had 15 countries buying Russia more than 40% of their gas. We decoupled. Europe and G7 was not able to reduce the capacity of selling to different countries and clients from Russia. We all know they sell at discount to India, to China, to others. But our dependency on Russia ended, significantly ended. And the natural partner, not only in oil and gas, as it happened immediately in 2022, 2023, our natural partner is in Africa. If we transfer technologies, we share capitals, and we help all the good entrepreneurial spirit in Africa to build a resilient capacity on this field. The second the second field where I think our cooperation is mandatory is the demographic consequence or the demographic dividend. You know the average age of an African, 19 years old. You know the average age of an European, 44 years old. Facts are facts. And if you deny them, they will knock your door. There is just one possibility. It's very hard in the digital society because the mantra of the manipulation of the algorithm is conflict, 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 insult, 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 polarization, polarization, polarization. But regardless of this difficulty, obviously we just can regulate the migration question with a huge diplomatic agreement between the departure country, the platform and passage country, and the destination countries. Without the cooperation of these 3 sources, players, the regulation of migrations becomes more difficult. As you know, in Europe, mainly in Portugal, we need migrations. because of our demographic aging. Just think, by the way, what would happen to restaurants, to hotels, to agriculture or civil construction in Portugal without migrations? Basically, they would collapse. So we have a scarcity of human resources. This is an opportunity, but needs to be a regulated opportunity. And the regulation needs the agreement of the three players: the departure, the platform, and the arrival. And normally the arrival is not the country of the arrival. Okay. And finally, on geopolitics, just two remarks. I was reading a very interesting research that annually Pew Research Center issues about popularity of United States and China among world countries. Developed countries and medium status countries. It's very interesting if you look at Africa. Both US and China are very popular. And the Western world needs to understand that history has some constants. Why many countries of Africa abstained on the question of Russia and Ukraine? Because their armed forces are very linked historically to Soviet or Russian supply, maintenance, and doctrine. You cannot ask African countries to dismantle their armed forces. They are popular. It's very interesting in many of the African countries tested, including Nigeria. Africans want to have good relations with the big powers and sovereign relations. And they think probably they need Americans for some kind of things, Chinese for other kind of things, Europeans for other kind of things. And I wouldn't condemn this, knowing the starting point, I wouldn't condemn, I just try to understand. And I must add that the impressive presence of China in Africa, not unconditional. There are a lot of controversies, namely about debt. But the impressive presence of China in Africa is not only the success of a Chinese foreign policy, it's also the consequence of the absence of the Western world. And we need to build, okay, you have unpredictability, you have instability, you have polarization, the situation is going worse to worse. Yes, but you have to build a stable corridor in the relation between Africa and Europe, independent of better or worse circumstances. It's our natural partner. And in that, having this in consideration, I'm worried, José Manuel mentioned it, I'm a bit worried with the possibility of a coup d'etat epoca, a coup d'etat era, recent era in Africa, because one of the great achievements from African Union and its regional organizations is an institutional framework. I deal with governments. Governments are based in the Constitution and by the rules of the Constitution. If you go out of the Constitution, it's becoming difficult on the recognitions and the results. And you all know, as I know, that in the Sahel region, you had in the last 3 years 7 coups d'etats. We should try to understand why they happened, why they mobilized young people, why we saw some resentment against specific European partners, and how Russia was behind of some of these attempts. Not exactly the state of Russia, but his security company, first Wagner. You know the new name of Wagner? Africa Corps. I'm not joking. It's the new name of Wagner Company. Those who know something about history can remember. This is a matter of worrying, and I think the institutions of Africa are very worried with this situation too. The second is a positive achievement. It's a consequence of the demographic dividend. When you have an average age of 19, when you live in a digital, growing culture, you have no memory. And by the way, you don't have also long-term thinking. You just, I usually say on the digital, history was yesterday night, and long-term is tomorrow morning. Okay, if you don't have memory, you don't remember apartheid. You don't remember civil wars. You don't remember colonial wars, imperial wars. What happened in South Africa is a very interesting phenomenon. It's the consequence of the demography. They are worried, namely young people, with the economic situation. Do I have a job? Can I have 2 meals during my day? Do I have a possibility of social mobility in my country? What happened? You remember, those in political science know what that means. The dominant parties linked to independence, linked to the end of apartheid, winners of the independence wars, etc. There is a certain decline of those dominant parties, and the nature of consequence, it was a very impressive decision, is establishing coalitions. Not exactly a very usual phenomenon. Establishing coalitions. Back to the best of the spirit of the end of apartheid, if you consider the parties that build the coalition. So, prepare yourself to change, a demographic change, a cultural change, and the political change also. And we should try, I'm absolutely convinced about that, we should build this stable corridor, special corridor between Africa and Europe to our mutual benefit. I wish you a very good journey, and thank you for the invitation to the EurAfrican Forum. Thank you.